The city woke to a morning draped in uncertainty. The sky a heavy tapestry of gray that couldn't decide whether to unleash rain or simply brood in silence. A thick fog clung to the streets, softening the edges of the towering buildings and muting the usual clamor of urban life. Yet the air buzzed with the restless energy of commuters rushing past one another, their footsteps a staccato rhythm against the pavement, punctuated by the impatient blare of car horns. Amid this familiar chaos, an undercurrent of something heavier pulsed through the crowd, a tension too subtle to name, but impossible to ignore. It lingered in the way people avoided eye contact, in the hurried glances they cast over their shoulders, as if the weight of the world pressed down harder today than it had the day before. Among the throng, a tall figure moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that set him apart. Marcus Green was a man who carried himself with purpose, his strides steady and unhurried despite the bustle around him. To the casual observer, he was just another face in the crowd, his simple coat and worn briefcase blending seamlessly into the sea of anonymity. But Marcus was no ordinary man. Beneath his unassuming exterior beat the heart of one of the state's most revered judges, a titan of justice whose name echoed through courtrooms with respect and awe. Years of tireless dedication had forged his reputation, each decision he rendered a testament to his unwavering commitment to fairness. Yet here, on these crowded streets, he shed the trappings of his title. Walking alone was his ritual, a sacred pause in a life spent wrestling with the complexities of right and wrong. The cool air brushed against his face, grounding him, reminding him of the world he fought to protect, a world that stretched far beyond the polished wood and stern gavels of his courtroom. With every step, he felt the mantle of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders, a quiet burden he bore with pride. Across the street, a police cruiser idled at the curb, its engine humming softly beneath the morning din. Inside, Officer Linda Hart sat with her hands resting on the steering wheel, her sharp eyes scanning the flow of pedestrians. Recently promoted to sergeant, Linda was no stranger to the rhythms of this district, a neighborhood marked by stark divides, where wealth and poverty clashed like storm clouds on the horizon. She'd spent years patrolling these streets, her instincts honed by countless encounters, her judgment shaped by a lens she didn't always recognize as clouded. There was a hardness in her gaze, a flicker of suspicion that had become second nature, born from too many nights spent navigating a system that rewarded certainty over curiosity. She prided herself on her ability to read people, to spot trouble before it erupted. But this morning, as her eyes landed on Marcus, something stirred within her, a gut reaction she couldn't quite explain. He didn't fit, she thought, to calm, to compose for a man walking alone in a place like this. His steady gait, the way he held his head high, it grated against the picture she'd painted in her mind of who belonged here and who didn't. She didn't know his name, didn't care to ask. To her, he was just another figure who stood out for all the wrong reasons. Without a second thought, she flung open the cruiser door and stepped onto the pavement, her boots striking the ground with a thud that echoed her authority. She straightened her uniform, her fingers brushing the badge pinned to her chest, and marched toward him with a purpose that brooked no hesitation. "Hey, you there," she barked, her voice cutting through the street noise like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Marcus paused mid-step, the sudden command pulling him from his thoughts. He turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers with a calm that bordered on unnerving. For a moment, he said nothing, his silence a shield forged from years of facing moments just like this. He knew the script all too well, suspicion, the demands, the unspoken assumptions that clung to him like shadows simply because of the skin he wore. Inside, a flicker of weariness stirred, but he buried it deep. He'd learned long ago that showing frustration only fueled the fire. Instead, he let his gaze settle on her, steady and unflinching, as if to ask, "What now?" Linda didn't wait for an answer. Her eyes narrowed, her lips tightening into a thin line as she sized him up. "Show me your ID," she snapped, her tone thick with distrust. "Where have you been? What are you doing here?" The questions tumbled out like accusations, each one laced with a certainty that left no room for doubt. She stood with her hands on her hips, her posture radiating control, daring him to defy her. Marcus didn't flinch. With a measured calm that spoke of a man who'd faced worse, he reached into his weathered briefcase, his fingers brushing against the papers within documents that held the weight of his life's work. He pulled out his identification and handed it to her, his movements slow but deliberate, a quiet assertion of dignity. "Here are my documents, ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, threaded with a politeness that carried its own strength. "I'm on my way to work." The words hung between them, simple yet heavy, a truth she couldn't yet comprehend. Linda snatched the ID from his hand, her eyes flicking over it with barely a glance. She didn't need to look closely, her mind was already made up. The man before her, dressed in plain clothes, walking with an air of confidence she couldn't place, didn't match the image she'd conjured. She rolled her eyes, a scoff escaping her lips. "Oh, sure," she muttered, loud enough for him to hear, "and I'm the President of the United States." Sarcasm dripped from her words as she tossed the ID back toward him. "Empty your pockets," she added, her voice sharp with mockery, daring him to push back. Inside Marcus, a tide of frustration swelled, a slow burn that threatened to break through the calm he'd so carefully maintained. He knew that one wrong move could turn this moment into something far uglier. With a deep, steadying breath, he set his briefcase gently on the ground, raising his hands slightly in a gesture of compliance. It wasn't surrender, but a calculated choice to keep the peace, to protect himself from a system that too often saw him as a threat. He met her gaze, his eyes steady, silently pleading for her to see reason. But Linda wasn't done. She stepped closer, her hands diving into his briefcase with a roughness that bordered on disdain. Papers spilled onto the pavement, legal briefs, personal notes, the remnants of a life dedicated to justice scattered like leaves in the wind. She picked up a document, her fingers crumpling the edge as she skimmed it with a sneer. "What kind of nonsense is this?" she scoffed, reading a line aloud in a tone that mocked its very existence. "Is this supposed to be some kind of joke?" Her laughter was brittle, a sound that grated against the morning air. Marcus stood still, his composure a fortress against her contempt. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the injustice of it searing into his soul. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, but he knew the cost. Instead, he spoke with a quiet resolve that cut through her derision. "They're court decisions," he said, his voice steady as stone. "I'm a judge." The word landed like a thunderclap. Linda froze, her hand hovering over the scattered papers, the sarcasm in her expression faltering for a fleeting second. A judge, the idea was absurd, laughably man-like him, here, claiming such a title. She barked out a laugh, hollow and forced, her disbelief a shield against the doubt creeping into her mind. "A judge," she repeated, her tone dripping with scorn. "Please, spare me. I've heard every excuse in the book, but this one's a masterpiece." "All right, Judge, let's take a trip to the station and sort this out." The air shifted then, the dynamic tilting as the world around them took notice. Bystanders who'd been hurrying past moments before slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Phones emerged from pockets, cameras trained on the scene as whispers rippled through the growing crowd. An older woman, her face lined with years of wisdom, pushed through the onlookers, her eyes widening in recognition. "Do you know who he is?" she cried, her voice trembling with urgency as she waved her arms at Linda. "That's Dr. Marcus Green. He's a judge." Her words carried a mix of awe and indignation, a plea for the truth to be seen. Linda barely glanced her way, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't want any trouble, ma'am," she snapped, her focus still locked on Marcus. "Move along." But the crowd wasn't so easily swayed. More voices joined the chorus, murmurs of confusion and anger swelling as people began to record the encounter. The tension thickened, a storm brewing in the space between Marcus and Linda. He felt it shift, the weight of eyes on him, the spark of something larger igniting. He couldn't stay silent any longer. "Look again at the documents I gave you," he said, his voice rising just enough to command her attention, firm but unshaken. "My name is Marcus Green. I'm a judge in the Central District of this city. Check the system." His words carried a quiet power, a challenge wrapped in calm, daring her to confront the truth. For the first time, Linda hesitated. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some questioning her actions, others nodding in Marcus's favor. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but her pride held firm. A wall she refused to let crumble. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "We'll see about that, Mr. Green," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm as she gestured toward the cruiser. "If you're really who you say you are, you've got nothing to worry about." As she pushed him toward the car, Marcus felt the moment tip into something bigger. The onlookers pressed closer, their voices a rising tide of confusion and outrage. Inside, a storm regained a blend of disbelief at her blindness, frustration at the system that enabled it, and a fierce resolve to expose its flaws. Linda's grip tightened, her determination unyielding, but her eyes betrayed a crack in her certainty. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was a reckoning, a collision of power and prejudice that would ripple far beyond this foggy morning, laying bare the cost of unchecked authority and the enduring fight for justice. The air was thick with tension as Linda escorted Marcus toward the squad car, her boots clicking sharply against the pavement, under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. She muttered something just loud enough for him to catch, her voice dripping with a bitterness she didn't bother to hide. "You talk a good game," she said, her words slicing through the cool night air. "But why do you all think you can pull the wool over our eyes? I've hauled in doctors, lawyers, engineers, you name it. It's nothing personal, just the same old song and dance." The venom in her tone stung, a barbed arrow aimed not just at Marcus, but at an entire narrative she'd already written in her mind. She didn't see him, she saw a type, a shadow of every assumption she'd ever carried. Marcus felt the weight of her words settle into his chest like a stone. He clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to fire back. He'd been here before too many times to count standing on the same jagged edge of prejudice, staring down the same tired script. The sting wasn't new, but it cut deeper tonight. Linda's dismissal stripped away the years he'd spent building a life of purpose, reducing him to a caricature in her eyes. It wasn't shock that trembled through his hands as she nudged him forward. It was the slow burn of indignity, the exhaustion of fighting a battle that never seemed to end. He knew better than to let his anger flare. Not here, not now. Survival demanded composure. So he swallowed the fire and let his breath steady, even as his heart thudded against his ribcage. The squad car loomed ahead, its chipped paint glinting faintly under the streetlights. Linda's grip on his arm was firm, her movements mechanical as she opened the door and gestured him inside. The crowd that had gathered, neighbors, passers-by, faces half-lit by the glow of their phones, murmured softly, their voices a low hum of curiosity and judgment. Marcus slid into the back seat, the worn leather creaking under his weight, and as the door slammed shut, the sound echoed like a gavel striking wood. He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, the darkness behind his lids a brief refuge. The murmurs faded, replaced by the hum of the engine as Linda climbed into the driver's seat. This wasn't just a routine ID check. It felt like a proclamation, a cold reminder that no matter how high he climbed, some would always see him as less than nothing. Inside the car, Linda's words lingered like a bitter aftertaste. "It's nothing personal," she'd said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I know this type of story well." But to Marcus, it was personality, bone-deep personal. Every syllable she spat carried the weight of a system that had judged him long before he'd ever had a chance to speak. He was no stranger to this. As a judge, he'd spent decades in courtrooms, wielding the law like a shield for those who'd been wronged. Yet here he was, cuffed in the back of a squad car, his legacy reduced to the color of his skin. Marcus Green, he thought, the name reverberating in his mind like a quiet mantra. A man who's given his life to justice, and this is what it comes to. The city streets rolled by outside the window, bathed in the sodium orange glow of street lamps. People moved through their lives long, arguing, oblivious while Marcus sat trapped in this rolling cage, a silent passenger to his own humiliation. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thud of tires against asphalt. He wondered what churned behind Linda's stern facade. Did she ever question herself? Did she feel the faintest flicker of doubt as she drove him through these familiar streets? Or was this just another shift, another faceless figure to process and forget? Her posture rigid, unyielding, suggested this was routine, that Marcus was just another checkbox on her list. When they reached the station, the car slowed to a stop, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Linda stepped out first, her movements brisk and authoritative, as if she owned the ground she walked on. Marcus followed, his head high despite the storm raging within him. The station doors swung open, and for a split second, the chaos inside paused. Officers shuffled paperwork, phones rang incessantly, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and sweat. Eyes turned toward him, some curious, some indifferent before snapping back to their tasks. But then, a middle-aged officer with graying hair and a face etched with fatigue froze mid-step. His brows shot up, recognition flashing across his features like lightning. He crossed the room in quick strides, his voice low but urgent as he leaned toward Linda. "Do you have any idea who you've got there?" Linda barely glanced at him, her stance unwavering, her confidence a fortress. "Of course I do," she shot back, her tone dripping with disdain. "He's just another one of those important types who thinks the rules don't apply." Her words were a wall, built to keep out any hint of doubt. But the officer's expression tightened, a mix of disbelief and unease creeping into his eyes. "Linda," he said again, his voice sharper now, "do you really know who he is?" She faltered, just for a heartbeat, her eyes narrowing as if sensing a crack in her armor. Before she could snap back, the officer turned to Marcus, his tone softening into something almost reverent. "Sir, I'm so sorry. This is a terrible mistake. You shouldn't have been treated like this." The words hit Marcus like a sudden burst of light, illuminating the shadowed corners of this nightmare. For the first time since Linda had stopped him, someone saw him not the stereotype, not the threat, but the man he truly was. Linda stood rooted to the spot, her face a battlefield of confusion and defiance. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice wavering for the first time. "What are you saying?" The officer drew a deep breath, his gaze steady. "This is Judge Marcus Green, one of the most respected figures in our judicial system." The revelation hung in the air, a thunderclap that silenced the room. Linda's face drained of color, her bravado crumbling like a house of cards in a storm. Her eyes darted from the officer to Marcus, and in that fleeting moment, the enormity of her error crashed over her. She had accused a judge, a man whose life's work was justice off being a criminal, humiliated him in front of a crowd, all because she'd seen only what she wanted to see. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, the walls of her certainty collapsing around her. Marcus watched her falter, but there was no triumph in it for him. He didn't relish her discomfort or the way her hands twitched as she grappled with the truth. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the weight of years spent fighting for what was right. "You didn't know," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "but that's not the issue. The problem is that you assumed the worst about me without ever knowing who I was. This isn't about me being a judge, Linda. It's about how people like me, people who look like me, are treated every single day." The station seemed to hold its breath, the hum of activity fading into a distant murmur. The officer beside Marcus nodded, his face grim but resolute. "He's right, Linda. This isn't just one mistake. It's about how we judge people based on what we assume, not who they are." Linda shifted, her shoulders hunching slightly as the weight of their words pressed down on her. She'd built her career on control, on certainty, but now she stood exposed, raw and uncertain, her worldview cracking under the strain. Marcus let the moment linger, his gaze steady, but not cruel. He'd seen this dance before: shame, deflection, the refusal to face the flaws in a system upheld by those too proud to question it. But he wasn't here to punish Linda. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to illuminate a truth that stretched far beyond this station, beyond this night. With a slow, deliberate breath, he spoke again, his voice a quiet force. "You need to understand, Linda, this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who faces this every day. People judged before they can even open their mouths. Dismissed, pushed aside, or worse, treated like criminals for no reason other than their skin. I've fought this my whole career. This isn't new. This is the story of countless lives. And it's a story that won't end until we all see the cost of wielding power without justice." The lesson hung heavy in the air, a mirror held up to a world too quick to judge, too slow to learn. Linda's eyes flickered with something wild, perhaps, or the first faint stirrings of doubt. Marcus stood tall, not as a victor, but as a witness to a truth that demanded to be heard. The consequences of unchecked authority had never been clearer, and in that quiet station, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, a seed of change took root. Only someone dared to water it. The air in the room hung thick and heavy, saturated with an unspoken truth that had been buried for far too long. A truth Marcus had carried on his shoulders every single day. A truth that Linda and the others had ignored, dismissed, or simply failed to see until this very moment. It wasn't just about what had happened here, in this cramped police station, with its flickering fluorescent lights and peeling paint on the walls. It was about something far greater, something that stretched beyond these four walls and into the streets, the courthouses, the classrooms, and the boardrooms of the city. Marcus stood there, his posture unshaken, his dark eyes steady and piercing, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve that seemed to radiate through the tension like a beacon. He knew this wasn't about him alone. It never had been. It was about the countless others who faced the same indignities, the same assumptions, the same injustices, day after day, with no voice to call it out. Linda, on the other hand, felt the ground beneath her trembling, as if the solid foundation of her authority had begun to crack and splinter beneath her polished boots. Her face, once so certain and stern, now betrayed a storm of emotions, confusion swirling in her furrowed brow, shame burning in the flush of her cheeks. She had heard words like Marcus's before, fleeting snippets in debates on the news or casual conversations over coffee, but they had always been distant, abstract, easy to brush aside. Now they crashed into her like a tidal wave, spoken directly from the man she had just humiliated without a second thought. Her mind scrambled, racing through a maze of justification, spruik, protocol, the heat of the moment, but each excuse crumbled before it could fully form. She had misjudged him, acted on instinct rooted in something uglier than she cared to admit, and now the silence between them stretched taut, heavy with the weight of her mistake. She wanted to speak, to say something that could stitch the moment back together, but her throat tightened, and her tongue felt like lead. There was no undoing this. Around them, the room seemed to shift, the atmosphere morphing from the sharp edge of confrontation to a quieter, more introspective stillness. The officers who had lingered in the background, their navy uniforms blending into the dim corners, exchanged fleeting glances. Some shifted their weight uncomfortably, boots scuffing against the tiled floor, their eyes darting to the ground as if avoiding the mirror Marcus's words held up to them. Others stood straighter, their faces tightening with a flicker of realization, as though the implications of this encounter were sinking in for the first time. One officer, a younger man with close-cropped hair and a nervous twitch in his jaw, clenched his fists at his sides, his discomfort palpable. Another, older and grizzled, with lines etched deep into his forehead, stared at Marcus with a mixture of curiosity and unease, as if questioning the biases he'd carried for decades without a second thought. The air buzzed with their unspoken thoughts, a collective reckoning unfolding in real time. For Marcus, though, this wasn't personal, not entirely. Even as he stood there, the sting of Linda's earlier words still echoing in his ears, his calm demeanor never wavered. He had felt the weight of eyes on him before, the assumptions that clung to him like shadows, the subtle and not so subtle ways people tried to shrink him down to fit their preconceptions. But he had learned long ago that this fight wasn't just about his own dignity. It was about the system, a sprawling, creaking machine that churned out moments like this with relentless consistency. He understood that pointing fingers and shouting accusations wouldn't dismantle it. Change, real change, came from something harder, accountability. It came from people like Linda, like these officers, looking inward and choosing to do better, not out of guilt, but out of a recognition that the cost of inaction was too high. And in this fleeting, fragile moment, Marcus saw an opening not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by that same system. He turned his gaze to the officer who had stepped in earlier, a man named Daniels, whose broad shoulders and weathered face suggested years on the force. Daniels had been silent until now, but Marcus had noticed the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when Linda snapped at Marcus, the way his eyes softened as the truth began to spill out. There was something in Daniels's posture, a slight slump in his shoulders that hinted at discomfort, but also at a dawning understanding. Marcus met his gaze and spoke, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "I don't want your pity," he said, each word deliberate, cutting through the haze of the room. "I'm just one man. What I need you to do is think about everyone else with people who don't get to stand here and talk like this. The people who don't get a chance to prove themselves before things spiral out of control." Daniels nodded slowly, his weathered face softening further, the hard lines of his earlier tension melting into something more thoughtful. He ran a hand over his stubbled chin, his eyes drifting to the floor for a moment before meeting Marcus's again. "You're right," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that surprised even him. This shouldn't be happening. Not like this." His words hung there, simple yet profound, a crack in the armor of indifference that had shielded him and his colleagues for too long. Linda felt the shift in the room like a physical force, the eyes of her fellow officers turning toward her, their expressions a kaleidoscope of judgmental disappointment. In the tight-lipped frown of the younger officer, disbelief in the wide-eyed stare of the grizzled veteran. For a moment, she felt utterly exposed, as if the badge pinned to her chest had become a spotlight illuminating her failure. She had always seen herself as the pillar of order, the one who upheld the law with unwavering certainty. But now, standing in the wreckage of her own actions, she felt small, fragile, as if the world she'd built around her authority was collapsing brick by brick. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, and she clenched them into fists to steady herself. She wanted to retreat, to hide from the weight of their gazes, but there was nowhere to go. The truth was out, stark and undeniable, and it pinned her in place. Marcus, ever the tactician, saw the moment for what it was, a reckoning, not just for Linda, but for everyone present. The air crackled with the raw honesty of it all, a truth laid bare like an open wound. He straightened his spine, his tall frame commanding the space without effort, and turned back to Linda. His voice wasn't laced with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "What I want from you, Linda," he said, "is to see the bigger picture. What happened to me today isn't some fluke. It's happening everywhere, in every street corner, in every precinct, in every courtroom and classroom and office. This isn't just about the police. It's about a prejudice so deep it's woven into the fabric of everything we do." Daniels stepped closer, his boots thudding softly against the tile, and nodded in agreement. "We've got to face it," he added, his voice gaining strength, as if speaking the words aloud had solidified something within him. "We can't keep acting like this isn't real." His eyes flicked to Linda, not with accusation, but with a challenge. He called to step up, to be part of something better. Marcus softened his tone, his gaze locking with Linda's. "This isn't about attacking you," he said gently, though the firmness beneath his words remained. "It's a wake-up call for you, for me, for all of us. We can't erase what happened here today, but we can decide what happens next. The question is, will we?" The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the gravity of everything he'd said. Linda didn't answer right away, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. But Marcus saw a faint glimmer in her eyes, a spark of comprehension flickering to life. She wasn't there yet, not fully, but the seed had been planted. Maybe, just maybe, she'd find her way. One by one, the officers began to drift away, their footsteps echoing in the stillness as the tension in the room ebbed like a receding tide. Marcus remained rooted where he stood, his mind already spinning with what came next. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning, the first tremor of something seismic. The system could change, would change, but only if enough people faced the truth head-on. And Marcus knew, deep in his bones, that this moment was a pivot point not just for him, but for the collective conscience of everyone it touched. As he stepped out of the station into the crisp evening air, the weight of the encounter clung to him, though his face remained a mask of composure. The sky was streaked with the last hues of sunset, casting long shadows across the pavement. Around him, the world seemed to tilt ever so slight. Lithe glances of passers-by lingered a little longer, their expressions a mix of curiosity and recognition. Word was spreading already, carried on the invisible currents of the digital age. Phones glinted in hands, cameras clicked softly, capturing the man who had faced humiliation with grace. who had turned a moment of injustice into a clarion call for something better. Marcus had long understood that patience was his greatest weapon, a quiet strength that disarmed escalation and forced reflection. And now that patience was rippling outward, touching the crowd that had gathered outside, the onlookers who had recorded it all, the strangers who would soon see the video and feel its impact. Back inside, Linda stood frozen, the hum of the station fading into a distant buzz as her mind replayed the scene over and over. She saw Marcus's calm face, heard his steady voice, felt the sting of her own assumptions unraveling in real time. She had spent years wielding the law like a shield, convinced she was on the right side of justice. But today, that shield had cracked, revealing a truth she couldn't unsee. Her version of justice had been narrow, flawed, and painfully human. Her chest tightened with a mix of regret and fear for what she'd done, fear of what came next. The whispers of her colleagues swirled around her, their voices low but piercing. Some cast sidelong glances, their discomfort mirroring her own. Others nodded faintly, as if waking up to their own roles in the larger story. There was no escaping it now. The consequences were unfurling, and Linda knew she'd have to face them, ready or not. Outside, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket, an insistent vibration that pulled him from his thoughts. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was: President of the Court of Justice, a man whose voice carried the weight of authority tempered by concern. Marcus answered, his tone as steady as ever, even as the world seemed to shift beneath his feet. Marcus, the voice crackled through the line, urgent and threaded with disbelief. I've seen the video. This is unacceptable. The court stands with you. Need to figure out how to address this publicly. Marcus listened, absorbing the words, but his mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about the system that had birthed this moment, the deep-rooted flaws that needed to be uprooted. This isn't about me, he said firmly, cutting through the concern on the other end. This is about... He paused, letting the words hang, because they carried a truth too vast to rush. This was about justice, and not the shallow, performative kind, but the real, messy, transformative kind. It was about the consequences of power wielded without thought, about the lives diminished by apathy and bias. Linda's mistake had been a spark, but the fire it ignited could burn through the illusions they'd all clung to. And as Marcus walked away from the station, the city humming around him, he knew this was only the start. The lesson was clear. Power without accountability was a hollow shell, and justice, true justice, demanded more than words. It demanded action, reflection, and a willingness to change. The seeds were sown, and now the world would decide what grew from them. The city hummed with tension that morning, its streets alive with the murmur of a story that had erupted overnight, spilling across every corner like wildfire. Marcus Green stood at the center of it all, though not by choice. What had begun as a fleeting encounter on an ordinary street, a clash with a police officer named Linda, had spiraled into something uncontainable, something that now pulsed through the airwaves and flickered across millions of screens. He could still feel the sting of that moment, the way Linda's voice had sharpened, with unwarranted suspicion, the weight of her badge pressing down on him as though it were a weapon rather than a shield. It wasn't just her actions that lingered in his mind, it was the deeper truth they revealed, a truth far bigger than one person's mistake. On the phone, the president's voice crackled through the line, heavy with the burden of decision. Marcus had just finished laying out his thoughts, his words deliberate and measured, each one carrying the gravity of a man who'd spent years wrestling with the world's injustices. Punishing her isn't the answer, he'd said, his tone steady despite the storm brewing inside him. If we stop there, we're just pruning a weed instead of digging out the root. The silence that followed stretched long and taut, a thread pulled tight enough to snap. Marcus could almost hear the president's mind turning, sifting through the implications. Finally, the older man spoke, his voice softened by reluctant understanding. What do you propose we do? Then, Marcus exhaled, the breath he'd been holding escaping in a quiet rush. He leaned against the wall of his modest living room, the faint hum of traffic seeping through the window. We can't let this be about one officer, one incident, he said, his resolve hardening with every word. This is a chance to confront something: systemic structural racism, Bias woven into the fabric of how we operate. It's not just the police. It's the courts, the communities, the way we all look at each other. We need to bring everyone to the table. Officers, citizens, advocates, and start talking. Really talking. About change. The president paused again, and Marcus could picture him, graying hair, furrowed brow, a man accustomed to quick fixes now facing a problem too vast for simple solutions. I see your point, he said at last. Let's organize a public forum. We'll call in leaders from every Anglopolis, civil rights groups, local voices. This isn't about an apology. It's about a reckoning. As the call ended, Marcus set the phone down on the worn wooden table beside him, his fingers lingering on its edge. A quiet fire burned in his chest, not anger, not triumph, but purpose. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous, paved with skepticism and pushback, with voices shouting over one another in a clamor of misunderstanding. But he wasn't daunted. This wasn't about glory or headlines. It was about peeling back the layers of a society that had festered too long in silence, about forcing it to confront the prejudices that simmered beneath its surface. He'd seen those biases up close, felt their bite, and he wasn't here to play the hero. He was here to shift the tide. Meanwhile, miles away, Linda sat motionless in her parked car, the steering wheel cold beneath her clenched hands. The world outside was a blur, but inside her mind, a tempest raged. She replayed the encounter with Marcus over and over, the way she'd snapped at him, her tone dripping with assumptions she hadn't even questioned at the time. Now, with the video ricocheting across the internet, those moments haunted her. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat, a chorus of notifications she couldn't bear to face. The clip had gone viral within hours, her face plastered across screens, her name whispered in anger and disgust. She could feel the weight of a million eyes boring into her, stripping away the armor of her uniform, leaving her exposed and raw. Her chest tightened as the shame settled in, thick and suffocating. She'd misjudged Marcus completely, a threat where there was none. Let her own unspoken biases steer her hands and her words. The humiliation was unbearable. But worse was the dawning realization of what she'd done, and not just to him, but to herself. She'd spent years climbing the ranks, earning the respect of her peers, crafting an identity she could be proud of. Now, it teetered on the edge of ruin. The higher-ups had already taken notice. She'd seen the missed calls from her supervisor, the curt text summoning her to the station. She had a choice to make, and it loomed like a shadow she couldn't outrun: cling to denial and let the world tear her apart, or step into the storm and face the truth of her actions. By the next morning, the city felt like it had been jolted awake, its pulse quickened by the story of Marcus and Linda. News vans lined the streets, their antennas piercing the sky, while reporters clamored for sound bites. Social media churned with fervor. Clips of the confrontation racked up views, comments flooding in like a tidal wave. Some rallied behind Marcus, their voices ringing with calls for justice. Others defended Linda, insisting it was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But beneath the noise, a growing chorus demanded something more, not just punishment, but transformation. For Linda, the chaos was a living thing, wrapping its tendrils around her every thought. She sat at her kitchen table, the room dim save for the pale light filtering through the blinds. Her phone lay before her, its screen a mosaic of messages from colleagues offering tepid support, others from strangers hurling vitriol. She stared at it, her hands trembling slightly, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't how she'd imagined her career unfolding. She'd always seen herself as fair, as someone who upheld the law without prejudice. But the truth, stark and unyielding, stared back at her through that viral video. She'd failed, not just Marcus, but the principles she'd sworn to protect. The drive to the station felt endless, the familiar streets now alien under the scrutiny of a city on edge. When she arrived, the air inside was thick with unease. Officers milled about, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting toward her as she passed. She kept her head down, the linoleum floor blurring beneath her steps. But she couldn't escape the whispers. "Did you see the video?" one murmured to another. "She's done for," came the reply, sharp and low. Even those who'd known her for years, partners she'd shared coffee with, laughed with, watched her with a mix of pity and distance. She'd crossed a line, and the unspoken question hung heavy. Could she come back from this? The meeting with her supervisor took place in a cramped office, its walls lined with faded certificates and a single flickering light overhead. Captain Reynolds sat across from her, his broad frame filling the chair, his face etched with lines deepened by years of tough calls. She'd always respected him, his sternness tempered by a fairness she'd relied on. But today, his eyes carried something new, a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any reprimand. "Linda," he began, his voice low and steady, "what happened yesterday isn't something we can sweep under the rug. That video's everywhere. People aren't just questioning you, they're questioning all of us." She nodded, her throat tight, her stomach twisting into knots. She wanted to argue, to explain herself, to claw back some shred of dignity, but the words wouldn't come. She saw Marcus's face in her mind, calm defiance in his eyes, the way he'd stood his ground, and she knew there was no defense for what she'd done. "I know," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "I messed up, Captain. I didn't see him, not really. I saw what I expected to see, and I acted on it. I was wrong, and I hurt him. I hurt a lot of people." Reynolds leaned back, studying her with a gaze that seemed to peel back her layers. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, until he spoke again, admitting it as a start. "Linda, but it's nowhere near enough. This isn't just a slip-up you can fix with an apology. You've got a responsibility, this badge, to the people we serve. All of them, not just the ones you're comfortable with. We can't pretend these biases don't exist. Not anymore. You're looking at reassignment, mandatory training on racism and bias, and a long, hard look at yourself. This is your chance to prove you're better than that moment." The words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper into her core. She'd known discipline was coming, but hearing it spelled out made it real. Her career, her identity, dangling by a thread. It was a bitter reckoning, a consequence she couldn't dodge. "I understand," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'll do the work. I don't want to be that person anymore." Reynolds nodded, his expression softening just enough to offer a sliver of hope. "Good. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way forward." Across town, Marcus sat in his small apartment, the morning light spilling across the floor in golden streaks. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind: president's call, the media frenzy, the endless stream of messages flooding his phone. But his mind wasn't on the noise. It was on the bigger picture, the one he'd fought to bring into focus. This wasn't about Linda. Not really. It was about the system that had shaped her actions, the same system that had shaped his life in ways he could never unsee. He thought of his childhood, off the sidelong glances, the assumptions. The doors quietly closed in his face, and he knew this moment was a spark, not the fire itself. His phone buzzed again, the president's name flashing on the screen. The public forum was taking shape, a gathering of voices that could either ignite change or fizzle into forgotten promises. Marcus answered, his voice calm but resolute. "We've got a shot here," he said. "Let's make it count." As he hung up, he felt the weight of what lay ahead, not just for him, but for Linda, for the city, for a society teetering on the edge of awareness. Justice wasn't about revenge. He knew. It was about consequences, about tearing down the structures that let power run unchecked, and he was ready to see it through, one steady step at a time. In the quiet streets of a neighborhood steeped in unspoken rules and hidden judgments, Marcus Green felt the first stirrings of a storm he'd long anticipated. He wasn't naive. He understood that the racial bias threading its way through every glance, every whispered assumption, wasn't going to unravel with a single heartfelt talk. This was a system carved deep into the bones of society, built brick by brick over generations, with prejudice as its mortar. Yet, as the phone kept ringing and voices on the other end grew louder, some angry, some hopeful, Marcus found a flicker of solace. Things were shifting, however slightly, like the first crack in a dam that had held too long. Change, he knew, would be a slow, jagged thing, a messy unraveling of truths too long buried. But the fact that people were finally talking, really talking, was a spark he couldn't ignore. It was a beginning, and that alone kept him steady. The days that followed swallowed Marcus whole. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, activists, and strangers who'd seen the video, a grainy clip of him standing calm and unshaken as Linda Hart, a uniformed officer, questioned his presence in a place she'd decided he didn't belong. That moment, captured by a shaky bystander's phone, had exploded across screens everywhere, turning Marcus into an unwilling emblem of dignity in the face of pressure. He'd never craved the glare of cameras or the weight of microphones thrust in his direction, but they found him anyway. Each interview drained him, yet fueled him. Every word he spoke was a chance to peel back the layers of a society riddled with racial wounds. The attention was a tidal wave, threatening to pull him under, but Marcus clung to its purpose, a megaphone for a cause that had festered in silence far too long. Justice, he thought, wasn't just about righting a single wrong, it was about dismantling the machinery that churned out those wrongs day after day. Meanwhile, Linda Hart's world was collapsing in on itself, a dizzying spiral she couldn't escape. The backlash had hit her like a freight train, swift, brutal, and unrelenting. Her inbox overflowed with messages. A handful offered quiet support, but most were venomous, sharp-edged words that cut deeper with every read. Her social media, once a mundane scroll of family photos and work updates, had morphed into a war zone. Strangers from coast to coast dissected her every move, her every word, branding her a villain in a story she hadn't meant to write. She'd never imagined that one fleeting decision, born of a glance, a hunch, a flicker of bias, would be plastered across the world for all to judge. It wasn't just the stern reprimands from her superiors that stung now. It was the public's gaze, the very community she'd vowed to shield, turning on her with a fury she couldn't outrun. Nights stretched long and sleepless for Linda. She lay in the dark, replaying that encounter with Marcus over and over, the scene looping like a broken film reel in her mind. His steady voice, his unyielding calm. How had she misread it so badly? She'd seen guilt where there was strength, suspicion where there was only patience. The shame burned hot, a relentless ache in her chest, but it was the guilt that truly devoured her. She'd sized him up in an instant: the skin, his clothes, the way he carried himself, and decided he didn't fit. She'd wielded her authority like a blunt weapon, never pausing to question the assumptions driving her. Now, reassigned to a desk job after a tense meeting with her supervisor, she faced mandatory training on bias and discrimination. It was a start, a small bandage on a gaping wound, but Linda knew it was only the first step on a road she wasn't sure she could walk. Could she change? Could she unlearn the instincts that had guided her for years? Or would she stumble, blind to the flaws she'd never dared confront? Across town, Marcus was gearing up for something bigger, a public forum meant to crack open the conversation about racial bias in a way that couldn't be ignored. The goal was ambitious: to shine a spotlight on the prejudices woven into the fabric of not just policing, but schools, courts, neighborhoods, every corner of life. He spent late nights drafting notes, his pen scratching across paper as he wrestled with the weight of what he'd say. This wasn't just another meeting. It felt like a hinge on which real change might swing. Words alone wouldn't topple a system. He knew that action would. Grit would. A collective refusal to look away from the ugly truths staring them all in the face. As the forum loomed closer, a restless energy buzzed through him. He'd sat in countless rooms like this before, but this time, the air felt charged. Community leaders, activists, even a few officers like Linda had our SVPD, alongside civil rights groups ready to roll up their sleeves. The room would hum with people hungry for more than talk. They wanted to do something. Linda, too, was preparing, though her steps faltered with doubt. An invitation to the forum had landed in her hands unexpectedly, a gesture that left her reeling. Face the crowd, face Marcus again. She wasn't sure she had the stomach for it, but a quiet voice inside insisted she had no choice. For weeks, she'd buried herself in books, seminars, stories, nothing to understand the depth of the bias she'd carried like a second skin. Each page turned, each voice heard, humbled her further, stripping away the defenses she'd built. But knowledge wasn't enough. It was what she did with it that mattered. The night before the forum, sleep eluded her entirely. She paced her small apartment, the shadows stretching long across the walls, her mind a tangle of regret and resolve. She'd apologized to Marcus in private, a halting, awkward exchange, but it felt hollow. The community deserved more, a public reckoning born of accountability, not a plea for absolution. As dawn broke, she stood before her mirror, her reflection pale and uncertain. She took a shaky breath, steeling herself. Today wasn't about erasing her mistakes, it was about owning them, about proving she could be more than the sum of her failures. The forum arrived with a crackle of anticipation. The room buzzed as people filed in rows of chairs filled with faces both weary and determined. The air thrummed with a mix of nerves and hope, a sense that this wasn't just another discussion, but a rallying cry. When Marcus stepped to the podium, the chatter died instantly, every eye locking onto him. He stood tall, his presence quiet, but magnetic, his voice rolling out like a steady tide. "Good morning, everyone," he began, each word deliberate. "Thank you for being here. We're not just talking about one moment today, we're talking about something vast, something rooted deep. The biases in our systems, in our streets, our schools, our courts, they've been ignored too long. It's time we face them, together." He didn't shout or accuse, he didn't need to. Marcus spoke of his life sidelong glances. The doors shut in his face, the weight of being judged before he could even open his mouth. His words carried no venom, only a raw, unflinching honesty that hit the room like a thunderclap. He wasn't just a symbol now. He was a man laying bare the cost of a society that too often saw color before character. The crowd leaned in, hanging on every syllable, and when he paused, the applause roared, not polite claps, but a swell of recognition, a shared ache for something better. Linda sat near the back, her pulse hammering in her ears. She'd read Marcus's words online, heard them secondhand, but here, in this packed room, they landed differently, harder, truer. They forced her to see herself, the officer who'd looked at him and seen a threat, instead of a neighbor. Her hands trembled in her lap as she replayed her own actions. The snap judgment that had spiraled into this. When her turn came, she rose on unsteady legs, the weight of every stare pressing down. She gripped the microphone, her voice quivering but resolute. "Good morning, I'm Linda Hart, the officer from the incident with Mr. Green. I'm not here to defend what I did. He can't. I judged him unfairly, saw his skin and not his soul, and I was wrong. I caused pain, and for that, I'm sorry." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Linda didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't even want it, not yet. She just needed to speak the truth, to let it hang there, raw and real. Then, a single clap broke the stillness, followed by another, until the room filled with sound. It wasn't absolution, it was acknowledgement, a start. For Marcus, it was a step toward justice, a reminder that power unchecked breeds harm. For Linda, it was a lesson in consequences, a chance to rebuild not just her badge, but her heart. And for everyone watching, it was proof that change, however slow, begins when the silence breaks. The air in the room shifted, heavy with anticipation, as Linda stood before the crowd. This wasn't a fleeting moment of accountability, it was a seismic break from the woman she'd once been. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't just owning up to a mistake. She was vowing to tear down the warped beliefs that had silently guided her every move for years. Her voice trembled at first, unsteady under the gaze of so many eyes, but as she spoke, it gained strength, cutting through the stillness like a blade. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, it was demanding something of herself, a promise to confront the ugly biases she'd never questioned before. The crowd watched her, some with arms crossed, others with tear-streaked faces, and as her words settled, a soft ripple of applause began. It wasn't loud or triumphant, it was cautious, tender, growing slowly until it swelled into a wave that filled the space with a fragile, flickering hope. Marcus sat near the back, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he listened. His dark eyes, steady and thoughtful, traced every word Linda spoke. Pride stirred in his chest, not a loud, boastful kind, but a quiet, glowing ember. It wasn't because the world was ready to absolve her. He knew better than to expect that. No, it was because she'd taken that first, jagged step toward something better. Change wasn't a lightning bolt, it didn't strike and remake a person in an instant. It was a choice, a slow unraveling of the self, and Linda had chosen it. As the sound of clapping hands faded, Marcus leaned back in his chair, the worn wood creaking beneath him. He felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. A reminder that this wasn't the end, but a beginning gone he'd helped spark with his own calm defiance against a system that had wronged so many for so long. The forum pressed on, the hum of voices rising like a tide. People stepped forward, community leaders with weathered faces and resolute tones, civil rights activists whose passion crackled in every syllable, even a handful of officers like Linda, their badges glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. These weren't just stories. They were confessions, raw and unfiltered, from men and women who'd wrestled with the same demons Linda faced. One officer, a weary man named James with gray streaking his temples, spoke haltingly about the years he'd spent letting prejudice twist his judgment. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his uniform as he described a night he'd stopped a young black man for no reason other than a gut feeling gone he now knew was rotten at its core. The room grew still, the air thick with the discomfort of truth, as James's voice broke, a fracture of shame and regret splitting through his words. Marcus watched him, noting the way his shoulders slumped, as if the admission had carved something out of him. It was a glimpse into the struggle so many carry, the exhausting labor of unlearning what a lifetime had etched into their minds. What had started with Marcus's quiet strength, his refusal to bow to injustice, was blooming into something tangible. The conversations weren't polished speeches or empty promises about new laws. They were messy, real, alive. People leaned forward in their seats, some nodding, others scribbling notes on crumpled paper. For once, the room didn't echo with the tired drone of bureaucracy. This felt different, like a reckoning that reached beyond words and into the marrow of those who listened. Marcus felt it to a fire kindling in his chest. This forum wasn't just a platform for his voice. It was a hammer striking at the foundations of a broken system. When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly, his presence commanding without effort. His deep voice rolled out, steady and fierce, as he painted a vision of education that didn't skim the surface, but plunged into the dark corners of the human psyche where biases festered. Unseen and unchallenged, he gestured with his hands, broad and calloused, as if he could shape the future right there in the air before them. The crowd hung on his words, some exchanging glances, others staring ahead, lost in thought, as the enormity of what he proposed sank in. As the day wore on, Marcus listened to the chorus of voices weaving together: teachers, cops, parents, kids, laying bare the ways prejudice had seeped into every layer of their lives. A school teacher with a soft southern drawl spoke of the way she'd once favored certain students, without realizing it, her cheeks flushing as she recounted the dawning horror of her own blindness. A young activist, barely out of her teens, her braids swaying as she gestured wildly, demanded more than talk, she wanted action, now. Her voice a sharp blade cutting through the room's tentative optimism. Marcus nodded to himself, his jaw tight. This wasn't just a police problem or a courtroom issue, it was a sickness that ran through schools, offices, homes. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the dusty windows, he knew the fight was nowhere near done. Change was a mountain, steep and treacherous, and they'd only just begun the climb. Yet, as he glanced around at the face some weary, some alight with purpose, he'd felt a whisper of progress, faint but undeniable. For the first time in years, people weren't just hearing him out of obligation. They were listening because they wanted to, because the truth had finally cracked through their defenses. This wasn't about dragging Linda through the mud or pinning blame on any one soul. It was about a deeper lesson. Every person, from the beat cop to the judge in his robes, held the power to either prop up a flawed machine or chip away at its rusted gears. Justice wasn't a gavel's bang or a single apology, it was the slow, deliberate work of choosing better, day after day. As the forum wrapped up, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city's hum a distant pulse, and answered. It was his effusive president of the Court of Justice wanted a meeting. His pulse quickened, a mix of excitement and dread surging through him. This was it, the pivot from speeches to deeds. The conversation he'd been clawing toward, about uprooting the rot in the system, was inching out of the forum's echo chamber and into the corridors of power. He'd already gotten word that training programs were in the works, that community outreach was being stitched together, but this meeting, this was the first real swing at turning promises into stone-cold reality. Back at the station, Linda's world had flipped upside down. Her days were no longer spent patrolling streets under the sun's glare, or filling out reports in the dim glow of a precinct lamp. Now, she sat in sterile classrooms, the hum of a projector overhead, surrounded by flip charts and stern-faced instructors. The Ray education program was relentless, hers dissecting unconscious bias, peeling back the layers of systemic racism, tracing the roots of the snap judgments she'd once trusted without a second thought. At first, it felt like wading through mud. The lessons grated on her, each one a jab at the identity she'd built as a protector, a servant of the law. She shifted in her seat, her uniform stiff against her skin, as the instructor's voice droned on about history she'd never been taught, redlining, Jim Crow, the quiet violence of inequality baked into the world she'd sworn to uphold. Her stomach twisted, a knot of unease she couldn't shake. Was this who she'd been all along, a cog in something she didn't even see? But as the weeks crawled by, something shifted. It wasn't just the facts piling up in her notebook, dates, names, statistics. It was the unraveling of the lens she'd worn her whole life. One afternoon, during a group session, she sat in a circle with other officers, their faces a mix of defiance and exhaustion. James, the veteran with the shaky voice, spoke again. This time, he told a story about a kid he'd roughed up, years aga-brown skin, hoodie, the kind of profile he'd been trained to suspect. His eyes glistened as he described the boy's fear, the way his own hands had tightened the cuffs without hesitation. Linda's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard tales like this before, brushed them off as one-offs, but now, with James's voice cracking like brittle glass, it hit her. This wasn't about rogue moments. It was a pattern, a system that rewarded those instincts, that turned good intentions into quiet atrocities. That night, alone in her cramped apartment, she sat on her couch, the TV flickering silently in the corner. Her mind churned, replaying every stop, every glance, every choice she'd made in uniform. She'd thought she was shielding her community, but from what? From whom? The realization settled over her like a cold fog. True protection meant fairness, not force, and she'd failed at it for years. By the time Linda finished the program, she was a stranger to herself. The woman who'd walked in brush, certain, cloaked in the righteousness of her badge, was gone. In her place stood someone raw, unfinished, painfully aware of her flaws. She wasn't perfect. She'd stumble again, she knew that. But she was determined to listen to the voices she'd once ignored, to see the people she'd once judged through a clearer lens. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned her badge back on, not with pride this time, but with a quiet resolve to earn it. Meanwhile, Marcus stepped into the courthouse, his shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. The president's office was a small, hushed space, the walls lined with books and the faint scent of old leather hanging in the air. The man behind the desk was older, his hair silvered, his eyes sharp but weary. Marcus laid out his plan with the precision of a craftsman's training that didn't pull punches. A rewrite of profiling protocols, a bridge to the community that wasn't just for show. His voice was firm, his hands steady as he gestured, but inside, his heart raced. This wasn't a plea, it was a demand for justice to mean something more than words on paper. The president listened, his fingers steepled, nodding at the weight of each point. "This is a long road, Marcus," he said at last, his voice gravelly but warm. "But I think we can do it. You've started something here, something we can't turn away from." Marcus met his gaze, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "I didn't start it, sir. The people who've borne the cost of this system did. I'm just carrying their torch." They hashed out details, new policies, transparency measures, timelines, each word a brick in the foundation of something better. When Marcus stepped outside, the city sprawled before him, its lights blinking against the dusk. He inhaled deeply, the crisp air biting at his lungs. It wouldn't be easy, change never was. The old ways would cling, stubborn and fierce, but they were cracking, bit by bit. The forum, Linda's reckoning, this meeting, it was all part of a slow, relentless push. Justice wasn't a single act or a grand gesture, it was 1,000 small choices. A refusal to let the powerful sleep easy while others suffered. Over the next few months, the city began to hum with that shift. Conversations spilled into streets, classrooms, precincts. What had begun with a tense standoff on a forgotten corner had ignited a movement tone that wouldn't stop until the lessons of fairness and the cost of unchecked power were carved into the bones of the system itself, for Marcus, for Linda, for everyone. The work was just starting and it would demand everything they had. Linda sat alone in the dim glow of her apartment, the faint hum of the city filtering through the cracked window. Her days had become a quiet storm of reflection, each moment heavy with the echoes of conversations that lingered like ghosts. One memory, in particular, gnawed here, a late-night chat with a grizzled sergeant she'd known for years. Over lukewarm coffee in the precinct break room, he'd leaned back in his chair, his voice low and rough, and confessed something that made her stomach twist. It was about a traffic stop, a routine pullover he'd done months ago. The young man behind the wheel hadn't broken any laws, hadn't even swerved an inch out of line. But to the sergeant, he'd looked out of place, a vague, unspoken judgment rooted in nothing more than a hunch. The man's dark skin, his worn hoodie, the beat-up corral of it had pinged something in the sergeant's mind. Something he couldn't quite name, but acted on anyway. "I didn't think twice," he'd admitted, his eyes drifting to the floor. "Could have gone bad, Linda. Real bad." That raw honesty, that flicker of regret in a man who rarely showed weakness, stuck with her. It wasn't just her own choices she needed to rethink, it was the whole damn system. Every officer who'd ever let bias pull the trigger on a decision. The phone jolted her out of her thoughts that evening, its shrill ring cutting through the stillness. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing the cold plastic. It was Officer Jackson, a friend who'd been with her through the long shifts and longer nights. His voice came through heavy, like he'd been carrying something too big for too long. "Linda," he said, pausing as if the words were stuck in his throat. "I heard about everything you've been dealing with. I'm proud of you." She froze, the weight of his praise sinking deep into her chest. Jackson wasn't the type to spill his feelings, was a brick wall of a man, all quiet nods and clipped sentences. But tonight, his tone carried something new, something unguarded. "You're doing the tough stuff," he went on. "We've all got junk to unlearn, you know, all of us." Linda clutched the phone tighter, her breath catching. She could picture him on the other end, maybe sitting in his cluttered kitchen, the faint glow of a cigarette burning between his fingers. His words weren't just support, they were an admission, a crack in the armor they all wore. They were all tangled up in this mess, every one of them, and pretending otherwise wasn't an option anymore. "Thanks, Jackson," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if it's enough, but I'm trying." When she set the phone down, the silence felt louder than before. She stared at the peeling paint on her wall, her mind churning. Could she keep going in this job? Could she bridge the gap between the officer she'd been quick to judge, slow to question, and the one she wanted to be? Every day felt like walking a tightrope, teetering between guilt and growth, but deep down, she knew she couldn't turn back. Out in the city, Marcus was a force of nature, his every step fueled by a fire that never seemed to dim. He'd taken on the beast of police reform with a ferocity that left people breathless, his vision sharp and unrelenting. His first move was a citywide push for bias training at some half-baked seminar with stale donuts, and a PowerPoint, but a deep, messy dive into the ways prejudice wormed its way into split-second decisions. He wanted officers to see it, to feel it, how a glance at a face or a car could spark a chain reaction of assumptions, how those assumptions could end in handcuffs or worse. But Marcus knew training alone wouldn't cut it. Real change had to grow from the ground up, from the streets that bore the scars of mistrust. So he teamed up with activists and neighborhood leaders, people who'd spent years shouting into the void. And together they built something raw and real, open forums, where cops and residents could sit across from each other and talk. Not just polite handshakes and forced smiles, but gut-wrenching, no-filter conversations about profiling, about batons cracking skulls, about the chasm of distrust that yawned between them. Marcus had watched those gaps shrink before, in fleeting moments of connection, and he'd be damned if he didn't make it stick this time. At one of those early meetings, the air was thick with tension, the community center's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Marcus stood near the front, his broad shoulders squared, when Tanya Harris stepped up to speak. She was a local fixture, A woman whose voice carried the weight of years spent fighting for her neighborhood. Her braids swung gently as she turned to face the room, her eyes sharp but weary. She'd seen too much, families torn apart, kids harassed, promises broken to trust easily. Yet tonight, as she looked at Marcus, a flicker of hope stirred in her chest. He wasn't just talk. He'd already put his weight behind the cause, and that meant something. "This isn't easy," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "What we're asking for, we want change, real change, accountability, a system that doesn't just protect some of us, but all of us. And it starts with listening. It starts with facing what's broken and fixing it together." The room hung on her words, a mix of guarded nods and skeptical stares. Linda was there too, seated among the officers, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight. She could sense the eyes on her, some curious, some accusing. These were people who'd been bruised by the very system she'd served, people still bleeding from wounds she'd helped inflict, even if she hadn't meant to. Her throat closed up, a lump of shame and fear rising fast. Could she ever make this right? But as Tanya kept talking, Linda's panic began to shift. This wasn't about wallowing in regret, it was about owning it, about stepping up to mend what was shattered. It wouldn't erase the past, but it was a start. Later that night, Marcus's phone lit up with a call from the president of the Court of Justice, a man whose usual gruffness had softened into something almost buoyant. "The training programs are ready," he said, his voice crackling with rare optimism. "It's happening. Marcus, that spark you lit, it's catching." Marcus leaned against his kitchen counter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't triumph, not yet, just a quiet nod to the progress they'd clawed out of the chaos. The fight was far from over, resistance still loomed like a shadow, and every step forward came with a battle. But the ripple was spreading, slow and stubborn, and that was enough for now. Across town, Linda was learning her own lessons, ones that hit closer to the bone. Back on patrol after the re-education program, the streets felt different, sharper, heavier. She tried to carry the training with her, letting it guide her hands and her words. But the pushback was real. Some colleagues clapped her on the back, murmuring encouragement. Others shot her sidelong glances, their whispers cold and cutting. To them, she'd always be the screw-up who'd crossed Marcus, no matter how hard she tried to rewrite the story. One humid afternoon, Linda's resolve faced its first real test. She was cruising her beat when she spotted a young man outside a corner store, his voice rising in sharp, jagged bursts as he yelled at the staff inside. Her pulse quickened, old habits surging to the surface. Draw the line, take control, shut it down. She pulled over, stepping out into the sticky air, her boots thudding against the pavement. But instead of barking orders, she paused, watching him. His hands were balled into fists, his face twisted with rage, but his eyes wide and wild held something else. Fear, maybe, frustration. Not a threat. In the old days, she'd have seen the outburst and nothing more, her hand already itching for her cuffs. Now, she forced herself to breathe, to look deeper. "Hey," she said, her voice low but steady, cutting through the noise. "I can see you're upset. What's going on?" He whirled on her, startled, his glare softening just a fraction. "What do you want?" he snapped, though the edge in his tone had dulled. "I'm here to listen," Linda replied, keeping her stance open, her hands loose at her sides. "But I need you to take it down a notch so we can sort this out. No one's here to hurt ya, we're just trying to help." It wasn't quick or clean. The conversation stretched long, weaving through his anger and her patience. But in the end, he walked away, not in cuffs, but with a shaky nod. Linda stood there after, the sun beating down, feeling the weight of what she'd done and what she hadn't. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about seeing people, really seeing them. And power could destroy if you let it run wild. She was starting to understand that now, one slow, hard-earned step at a time. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the city, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement where a young man stood, his voice rising in sharp bursts of frustration. His words weren't laced with malice or criminal intent. They were the raw, unfiltered cries of someone trapped by the weight of his circumstance, poverty, mistrust, a world that seemed to have already written him off. His hands clenched into fists, not to threaten, but to hold onto something, anything. as if the act of shouting could shake loose the invisible chains binding him. Nearby, Linda, a police officer with tired eyes and a badge that felt heavier every day, watched him carefully. She could feel the tension crackling in the air, a familiar electricity that she'd once mistaken for danger. But this time, she didn't react with the instinct she'd been trained to rely on. She didn't raise her voice or reach for her radio. Instead, she stood still, her breath slow and deliberate, letting the young man's anger spill out like water from a broken dam. As the minutes stretched on, Linda's calm presence began to seep into the scene. She didn't interrupt or judge, she simply listened, her face soft but steady, a quiet anchor in the storm of his emotions. The young man's shouts grew less jagged, his shoulders slumping as the fire inside him flickered and faded. By the time the situation unraveled itself, no cuffs had been snapped shut, no commands barked. It wasn't a flawless resolution, there were still edges of unease, but it was a step forward, a fragile thread of progress woven into a day that could have ended so differently. As Linda slid back into her patrol car, the engine humming to life beneath her, she let her mind wander over what had just happened. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles whitening for a moment as a realization settled deep in her chest. This wasn't just a fleeting encounter to log in a report and forget. It was a crack in the foundation of how she'd always seen her job, her role, the people she'd sworn to protect. Driving back to the station, the city blurring past her window in streaks of gray and gold, Linda's thoughts churned. She'd spent years viewing herself as a guardian, a shield against chaos, enforcing rules to keep the world from unraveling. But now, something shifted. Protection, she realized, wasn't just about wielding authority or drawing lines in the sand. It was about seeing the humanity in the faces she'd once reduced to problem strubelex, suspects, threats. The young man's outburst replayed in her mind, his voice raw with a pain she hadn't fully understood until now. For the first time, she felt the weight of her badge not as a burden of power, but as a call to connect, to listen, to bridge the chasm between the law and the lives it touched. It was a humbling thought, one that made her chest ache with both regret and a faint, unfamiliar hope. That evening, alone in her small apartment, Linda sank into the worn cushions of her couch, the dim glow of a lamp casting soft shadows across the room. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting her from her reverie. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the cracked screen as she read the message from Marcus, a community advocate whose steady resolve had become a compass for her in recent months. "We're making headway, Linda," the text read. "It's slow, but the change is happening." A small smile tugged at her lips, warmth spreading through her as she stared at the words. The work was far from finished, endless, but for the first time in what felt like years, she believed she was part of something meaningful. The exhaustion that had clung to her like a second skin began to lift, replaced by a quiet determination she hadn't known she still possessed. The next morning, Linda arrived at the precinct, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the murmur of overlapping voices. Her colleagues clustered near the break room, their conversation buzzing with news of an upcoming event, a community meeting Marcus had tirelessly organized with local leaders. They were tossing around ideas, proposals to mend the frayed ties between the police and the neighborhoods they served. Linda lingered near the edge of the group, her arms crossed, listening as they debated logistics and grumbled about the extra hours. She could sense the undercurrent of skepticism in some of their voices, but there was curiosity too, a cautious openness she hadn't noticed before. For her, it was more than just another meeting. It was a piece of the vision Marcus had been championing, a vision she was beginning to share. She saw herself in it, not as a lone enforcer, but as a link, a voice of reason forged from her own stumbles and hard-earned lessons. She'd made mistakes, misjudgments born from reflex and fear, but now she wanted to right them, to build something better from the ashes of her past. At the community meeting, Linda stood near the back of the crowded room, her uniform blending into the sea of faces. The air hummed with restless energy, hope, doubt, and everything in between as Marcus took the floor. He stood tall, his presence commanding yet warm, his words cutting through the chatter like a steady pulse. He spoke of trust, of the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding it, his voice rich with conviction but never preachy. Linda watched him, her gaze tracing the lines of his face greased with fatigue yet alight with purpose. He wasn't just spinning theories or reciting platitudes. He was laying out a path, something real and solid they could all grasp. "I know it's easy to feel like nothing will ever change," he said, his tone firm but laced with a quiet power that made the room still. "But we have to keep showing up. We have to keep having these hard conversations. And we need every one of you to make this work. It's not about blame, it's about moving forward together." Linda felt her head dip in a subtle nod, her resolve hardening as his words sank in. This wasn't just about her anymore, or Marcus, or any single moment of failure. It was about a future where the system didn't inspire dread, where justice wasn't a weapon but a promise. She thought of the young man from the day before, the fear in his eyes giving way to tentative relief, and she knew this was bigger than any one officer's redemption. It was about dismantling the mistrust that had festered for too long, a mistrust she'd once fed into without realizing. Justice, she understood now, wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, about facing the consequences of power misused and working tirelessly to ensure it didn't happen again. In the weeks that followed, the momentum grew, a slow but steady tide. Marcus threw himself into the effort with a patience that bordered on saintly, attending endless meetings with community leaders, officers, and advocates who shared his fire. He knew change wasn't a grand gesture, it was 1,000 small steps, each one fraught with resistance and doubt. The conversations were gaining traction. Policies addressing bias and discrimination were being drafted, debated, and simpleton. But Marcus wasn't naive. He saw the real battle in the quiet moments, the officer who hesitated before profiling, the citizen who dared to hope again. He navigated the pushback with gray skeptical colleagues who rolled their eyes, media that sensationalized every misstep, but he never wavered. His dark eyes, sharp with intelligence, softened when he spoke to the kids at the community center or the elderly woman who thanked him with trembling hands. He was a man who'd seen the system's flaws up close, and he'd made it his life's work to mend them, one painstaking stitch at a time. Linda, meanwhile, was finding her own path through the shifting landscape of her job. Back on active duty after a grueling re-education process, she faced each shift with a mix of dread and determination. The shadow of her past mistakes loomed large snap decisions that had escalated tensions. Words she couldn't take back, but they no longer crushed her. Instead, they fueled her, a reminder of why she had to keep going. She began to notice things she'd overlooked before. The way her fellow officers approached every call with suspicion, their voices hardening, their hands hovering near their holsters. It was second nature to them, a reflex honed by years on the job, and she'd been no different once. Now, she saw the cost way it widened the gulf between them and the people they served, turning every interaction into a potential standoff. One humid evening, a call crackled over her radio, a disturbance in a neighborhood where police were rarely welcomed. With open arms, Linda pulled up to the scene, her headlights sweeping across a group of young men gathered in a loose circle, their laughter cutting through the sticky air. One of them spotted her car, and the mood shifted instantly. Backs straightened, smiles vanished, replaced by guarded stares. She recognized that look, the braced posture of someone who'd been stopped too many times, questioned too often, not for what they'd done but for who they were. Her old self would have stepped out immediately, voice sharp, demanding answers. But this time, she lingered behind the wheel, her hands resting lightly on the dash as she studied them. There was no chaos here, no threat, just kids hanging out, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Linda exhaled slowly, then opened the door, stepping onto the pavement with deliberate ease. "Hey, guys," she called out, her tone light, almost conversational. "What's going on here?" The young men exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. "Just talking," one of them answered, his voice clipped, his gaze darting over her uniform as if weighing her intentions. She nodded, keeping her stance relaxed, her hands loose at her sides. "I hear you," she said. "I'm not here to stir anything up, just checking in. It's been a long night." Silence hung between them, thick and heavy, but she didn't push. She let it stretch, let them see she wasn't itching for a fight. Then, slowly, the tension eased. One of the guys smirked, a small crack in the wall they'd built, "We're good," he said, his shoulders dropping, just chilling. With a nod and a faint smile, Linda stepped back toward her car, the gravel crunching under her boots. As she drove away, the truth hit her like a quiet thunderclap. Nothing had escalated because she hadn't treated them like suspects. She'd seen them as people, flawed, wary, human, and that had made all the difference. Later that night, sprawled across her couch with the TV flickering in the background, she replayed the moment. Her old habits, force, control, the need to dominate had been so ingrained she hadn't even questioned them. Unlearning them had been brutal, a stripping away of everything she'd thought she knew. But it had brought her back to why she'd joined the force, not to rule, but to serve, to protect in a way that honored the humanity of those she encountered. The lesson stung. Power, wielded carelessly, left scars, but it also lit a fire in her she hadn't felt in years. The next day, Marcus got word from the courts. The bias training program he'd fought for was rolling out, and the early signs were good. Officers were showing up, some reluctantly, others with genuine curiosity. They were asking questions, prickly, uncomfortable ones, about their own assumptions, their role in a system that had failed too many. The old guard grumbled, their arms crossed tight, but even they couldn't deny the shift. The culture was bending, inch by inch, and Linda saw it too in the way her colleagues lingered after briefings, swapping stories instead of rushing off, in the way community leaders began to greet her with nods instead of glares. The forums pressed on, the discussions sharpening, digging into the meat of how to heal the wounds of profiling, how to root policing in respect rather than fear. Marcus poured himself into it all, his days stretching long into nights as he met with anyone who'd listen: cops, activists, shopkeepers, kids with dreams bigger than their block. He knew these weren't just talks, they were the foundation of something enduring. Change wouldn't come fast, years, maybe decades, but he could feel it taking root. Linda felt it too, a fragile but growing belief that justice wasn't a distant ideal. It was a consequence, a reckoning for those who'd abused their power, and a promise to those who'd suffered under it. Together they pushed forward, two souls bound by the same quiet hope that if enough people cared, if enough hands reached across the divide, the future could be different. It had to be. The sun dipped low over the city, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the precinct parking lot where Linda stood, her uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. She wasn't the same woman she'd been a year back then. She'd stride through these streets with a rigid certainty, her judgments swift and unyielding, shaped by years of unchallenged assumptions. Now, as she adjusted her badge and took a deep breath of the crisp evening air, she felt the weight of something new, a fragile, hard-earned awareness. She'd been forced to stare into the mirror of her own biases that day, a moment that had cracked her world open like a brittle eggshell, spilling out everything she thought she knew. It wasn't just a single epiphany. Fausch understood now that change was a relentless, winding road, one she'd have to walk every single day. Perfection wasn't the goal. It was about showing up, owning her missteps, and pushing forward, even when the doubts clawed at her insides like restless ghosts. Those doubts weren't quiet visitors. Late at night, when the precinct was silent save for the hum of flickering fluorescent lights, Linda would sit at her desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a lukewarm coffee mug, wondering if this transformation was real. What if it was just a fleeting phase, a mask she'd eventually shed? What if the communitithos faces she now met in the community police dialoguescould see the sleepless nights she'd spent wrestling with her past self? The fear gnawed at her that her efforts might dissolve into nothing, that the old Linda, the one who saw threats instead of people, might creep back in. But then she'd hear Marcus's voice in her mind, steady and warm like a lighthouse cutting through fog. Change is a marathon, not a sprint. He'd said it one evening over a shared thermos of tea during a break in one of those tense, early dialogues, his eyes tired but resolute. Marcus, with his unshakable belief in the long game, had become her anchor, reminding her that every faltering step forward mattered. Marcus himself stood a few feet away now, leaning against a squad car, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his gaze sharp as he watched the new recruits filing into the precinct for their evening session. He'd been at this longer than Linda, years spent chipping away at the granite wall of systemic flaws, his voice steady in rooms where others flinched or turned away. He'd started these dialogues, these raw, messy conversations that forced every Onakop's citizens, skeptics to sit down and face each other. It hadn't been easy. The first meetings were a battlefield of raised voices and folded arms, the air thick with mistrust. Marcus had felt the weight of every glare, every muttered insult. But he'd also seen the flickers of understanding that sometimes followed small, fragile sparks he nurtured with every ounce of his patience. Now, as he watched Linda step into those same rooms not as a bystander, but as a voice in the fray, he felt a quiet swell of pride. She'd stumbled into this fight, but she'd stayed, and that was no small thing. The dialogues themselves had evolved over the months, transforming from shouting matches into something resembling a fragile bridge. The community room where they met was modest, peeling paint on the walls, mismatched chairs creaking under the weight of nervous attendees. It buzzed with a strange, electric energy. On one particular evening, the fluorescent lights flickered as a young mother named Carla stood up, her hands trembling but her voice firm. She spoke of her son, a lanky teenager who'd been stopped by police one too many times for no reason other than the color of his skin. Her words hung heavy in the air, and Linda felt them settle into her chest like stones. She didn't flinch or look away at anymore. Instead, she leaned forward, her notepad forgotten, and listened. Really listened. Carla's husband, Javier, sat beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the officers and the exit, as if he still wasn't sure this wasn't a trap. He'd later admit, in a quieter moment over lukewarm coffee, that he'd come expecting nothing but empty promises, that he'd left with a sliver of hope surprised even him. For Linda, those nights were a crucible. She'd walk out into the cool night air afterward, her mind churning with the hard stories of fear, of anger, of lives shaped by the very system she'd once blindly upheld. She'd changed, yes, but the old reflexes still lurked, whispering in her ear during heated moments, "They're exaggerating. You're not the villain here." Each time, she'd pause, breathe, and push them back down. It was exhausting, this constant self-correction, but it was also liberating. She wasn't that officer anymore either, one who'd snap judgments like a gavel, who'd see a group of kids on a corner and assume trouble. Now, she saw faces, stories, lives, and when she spoke her voice steady, but softer than it used to be, people noticed. Carla had even squeezed her arm once as they left a session, a small gesture that felt like a lifeline. Marcus, too, had his own battles. He'd spent years dreaming of a day when the badge he wore wouldn't feel like a barrier between him and the people he served. He'd seen the training programs take root, officers sitting in circles, uncomfortable but present, unpacking their own blind spots. He'd watched the recruits, wide-eyed and uncertain, scribble notes as Linda shared her story, how she'd once let prejudice steer her, how she'd learned to stop and see. Marcus knew the road ahead was still littered with pathologies, maybe centuries, of injustice couldn't be undone with a few good intentions. But standing there, watching Linda address those rookies with a mix of vulnerability and steel, he felt something shift. Change wasn't just a solitary act, it was a current, rippling outward. What had started with one tense encounter, a confrontation that could have ended in shouting, or worse, had spread, touching Carla, Javier, the recruits, the precinct, the streets beyond. The city itself seemed to hum with that slow, stubborn shift. On a chilly afternoon, Marcus joined a group of officers and citizens planting trees along a neglected street, a small event. But the laughter that echoed between them felt like a victory. Linda was there too, her sleeves rolled up, dirt smudging her hands as she worked beside a teenage boy who'd once eyed her uniform with suspicion. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was easy, a far cry from the tension of months past. Back at the precinct, the bulletin board now held flyers for bias training sessions alongside duty rosters, a quiet sign of progress. The public still watched with wary eyes. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but there were fewer clenched fists, more nodded greetings in the grocery aisles. For both Marcus and Linda, the journey was a lesson in justice's slow burn. Power, they'd learned, could crush or it could heal, and they'd both seen its jagged edges up close. Linda through her own past mistakes, Marcus through the system he'd fought to reshape. Every misstep, every hard-won conversation, drove home the same truth. Real change demanded accountability, not just from those who wore the badge, but from everyone who shared the streets they patrolled. Linda felt it in the ache of her bones after long nights of listening. Marcus saw it in the flicker of recognition in a rookie's eyes. The work was grueling, unglamorous, and unfinished, but it carried a promise that from the ashes of old wrongs, something fairer could rise. As the sun sank lower, painting the precinct in hues of gold and shadow, they stood together, tired but unbowed, ready to keep walking that long, winding road because justice, they knew, was worth the fight.